Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto can time travel between the past and the present. Let it not be said that being Uzumaki Naruto is anything easy. He has an obligation to the future but a duty to the past, and a time-traveling jutsu that lets him travel between both. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 9, Broken Youth. Author's note: this may help to better understand the confusing seals used for time travel. Yes, their inconsistencies are purposeful. At any rate, so Naruto has one anchor seal to use, which he has placed in a Jounin jacket in Minato's time. It works like a signal, and every time Naruto jumps into the past from the future it draws him to that time like a beacon. That's all it does. The process of jumping from past to future and future to past require a whole other seal. And the sky wrenched apart, leaving nothing in its wake aside from a vertiginous swirl of patterned clouds and a boy laying on a grassy hillside, dandelions tickling his cheeks. He surfaced then, pupils dilating as they opened from what seemed to be a capricious dream, sky estewing, blinding gray. And he felt like he was surfacing after spending years asleep. That reticent, taciturn look to Naruto's face didn't suit him, Sakura thought, but there was little she could do about it. After all, how could she help him when he refused to help himself? Refused to let her help. The young Chunin could have punched the wall in her frustration. There was little else she feared more than anything, and that was helplessness. Uselessness. And that was all she could feel right now. Where have you been? It was hard to not sound accusing. Naruto's turning into the dazzling, bright gold of the sun, turning and walking away from her. Showing up out of the ether 3 weeks later, an unreadable, somber expression to his face that she didn't appreciate. Naruto was her rock, an unmovable, indomitable cornerstone which assured her of complacency, assured her that Naruto was Naruto, and that no matter how far he went or how long he left, he would come back. And he had come back. But not in the sense of the word. As if part of him had wandered off, maundered into the distance where she couldn't follow, somewhere unreachable, and left a disoriented, metaphysical man in its wake. This was Naruto. Sort of. It was telling how his eyes moved towards the window, to birds flying like black silhouettes in the sky. Freedom. Somewhere, out there. But where? A mission. He decided upon, tasting the words like he did his takoyaki, as if decided whether they would satisfy her. An A-class. Tsunade wanted me on a solo. Tsunade. Sakura's eyes narrowed. Reluctantly, Naruto met them, as if realizing he'd been caught. You never call her Tsunade. No, just old woman, old hag, old bat. But Sakura could admit defeat when it stared her in the face. Naruto had his own troubles, his own issues, and she knew, though she may not want to admit it, that he could and would solve them on his own. He wasn't pushing her away. He was giving himself space. And though she truly would rather drop-kick him in the face and physically wrench the answers out of his throat, if there was one thing Sakura had gained after the event of Team 7's breaking, it was patience. You're safe though, right? She whispered, beside herself. And okay? Truly. He nodded. I'm okay. And then, with a smile. I'm here, Sakura. But you're not. How is it? She asked airily, and made a vague motion with her hand. There. Wherever there is. Can you tell me that, at least? Is it cold? Do you eat enough? You're taking care of yourself, right? Of course I am. He chirrupied, like a brief memory of himself. But Naruto hadn't been carefree in a long time. Since he had come back from the Valley of the End, he'd mitigated from a rash, worryless little kid to a determined, driven young man. And though he'd never really lost his sunny disposition, he'd lost that naivete, that guileless mulishness that used to define him. I always take care of myself, Sakura-chan. It's a little cold there right now, but it'll be warmer soon. I'm fed, yes. I have ramen every day, more so than I should, anyway. I've got a place to stay and everything. This was just as much a part of Naruto as the loud brat who used to obnoxiously pester her for ramen. And as a smile cracked at his face, she knew the worst was to come. I'm really happy there. Those were the words she didn't want to hear. Kakashi thinks you're depressed. The blonde snorted. Yeah? Kakashi also thinks Jiraiya isn't a pervert. His opinion doesn't count. How odd, to see Naruto without his usual, visceral temerity. There was no impulsiveness to his lingering gaze, to his easy, wanderer's gait and the slow arch of his shoulders. The summer heat made the air hot and sticky, carpeted like a thick drapery of sweat and smelling like corn and farmlands. How Naruto managed to walk himself all the way out here, till the very edges of Konoha where nothing but sprawling farms held to the ground, Shikamaru would never know. It was just him, the blonde, and this dirt path hat seemed to wind all the way into the setting sun. Shikamaru groaned, rubbing at the back of his head. Sakura's been harping on me too. She says we hang out a lot, so I should know things. But this was a clear overstatement. Because, though Shikamaru and Naruto were close, they certainly didn't hang out a lot. That was to say, if Naruto hung out with anyone. The blonde had been mysteriously absent as of late, something which Shikamaru had keenly taken notice of. The blue of his eyes slid to the lazy Jounin beside him. And I told her it was too troublesome. Naruto snickered, shaking his head. Everything's too troublesome for you, isn't it? Well, a lot of things. Shikamaru shrugged, plodding beside the blonde sullenly. You, for one. Naruto smiled, a wrangled, warped mirror of its younger version. I feel like I've been doing that a lot to people lately. Being troublesome. Naruto nodded. Don't take it personally, said Shikamaru wryly. Pretty much everyone's troublesome. The blonde snickered. I won't then. Shikamaru let the conversation die down, wondering if it was really worth it to take the effort to pry into Naruto's secrets. They were his own, undoubtedly, and Shikamaru really didn't have a need, or any sort of burning curiosity to pick the blonde apart. He'd always been a bit of a study in progress, and Shikamaru had learned to just let him unfurl as he would without prior prediction. The brunette sighed, before taking a breath. Naruto. He began slowly. All these people being more annoying than usual, wouldn't have anything to do with your mission, would it? And the blonde closed, not in any physical way, just a brief flutter of his closed eyes. Is this an interrogation? It depends. Is that a yes? It's a maybe. Naruto's eyes opened, and he idly scuffed dirt with his shoes. Yes and no, said the blonde eventually, a certain voraciousness to his defeated voice. Sakura's just overreacting a bit. I think she expects me to defect from the village or something, but then again, she expects that out of everyone nowadays. And is it true? No. Naruto scoffed, scowling with irritation. Of course not. She's really worried. The brunette pointed out. And I know that she worries in general, but this is different. Sakura thinks I want to be on the mission more than I want to be home. And then, with a prolonged, exasperated look to Shikamaru's questioning gaze. Which I admit, might be a little true. So it's one of those alias missions. Something like that, yeah. Naruto didn't have the heart to tell him it was so much more than that. And he had a feeling Shikamaru didn't want to hear it anyways. Fortunately, the man was too lazy for his own good. Shikamaru sighed, looking up at a cloud with a digestive, if not lazy expression to his face. How troublesome. Naruto watched the same cloud. It's not just Sakura. Shikamaru revealed, blowing out a breath and giving a pointed look to Naruto. It's Kakashi, Hokage-sama, that dumb moron Kiba, somehow even between laps Lee has managed to notice. Naruto blanched. To think, all he had to do to get some attention around here was disappear for a few weeks. Talking makes you feel better, Shikamaru advised lightly. Hell no. And Naruto shot him down in flames. The lazy Nara looked like he was going to attempt round 2, but luckily for Naruto the two were interrupted as a Chunin whirled into existence from a cloud of smoke. He stepped out of the dissipating clouds, scroll held out in his hands. Uzumaki. For a moment, Naruto looked around for Kushina, before realizing that the Chunin was here for him. For me, Naruto said by way of greeting. The man, probably a new Chunin, as Naruto didn't recognize him, though his face looked vaguely familiar, as if the blonde had seen him some years below him at the academy. Nodded, giving the scroll to Naruto. It's from Hokage-sama. She wants. But Naruto didn't wait for his explanation. It was easier to just see the hag in person. Tsunade was halfway into her third stack of paperwork, and was feeling rather good about it. Of course, she was failing to remember the large towering stacks around her desk, but at this point, it didn't seem like she ever cared to remember them. She sometimes wondered how the hell that flaxen-haired brat had roped her into this job, but all she had to do was remember his smiling sheepish face as he finished the Rasengan, complaining about how he'd never get strong enough to be Hokage at this rate. All she had to do was remember his laugh. There was a slight remnant to that exact face in the man in front of her, a little around the rounded, scarred cheeks. Most of it had been swallowed wholly by the shadow of Minato though, who lingered over every inch of the tanned blonde like a venerable cloak. Naruto? She greeted, pleasantly enough. Naruto smiled back. Hey, Oba-chan. Ga. How are you? What's the scroll for? Tsunade shrugged. Formalities. Half of her had expected that Chunin to come back a few hours later, apologetically explaining that he hadn't been able to find the blonde anywhere. She hadn't wanted to send a hawk in fear of the same, only in a shorter period of time. And then, Jiraiya's informed me of your mission. It's not much of a mission. Naruto shrugged. I'm just observing time periods and not getting paid. He added pointedly. This could be considered more of volunteer work, considering there was no hefty check at the end. He's worried for you. Is that how this all started? Naruto rolled his eyes, exasperated. Typical. There was nothing faster than the Konoha grapevine. He didn't say as much, but I figured. She smirked, dryly. He's been unusually prudish lately. I haven't had any complaints from the local public baths. That is unusual. Naruto snorted, though wasn't nearly as surprised as he made it out to be. He could still recall Jiraiya's face, a somber mixture of resigned besetment and solicitude. I can call him, if you want. She began unsurely, eyes watching Naruto. If it helps, I can. No. Said the blonde, more hurriedly than he'd meant to. That's not necessary. Tsunade raised a brow at such an illicit reaction. For a moment there, though she may have just imagined it, she was sure there had been a brief flicker of fear rising in the blonde's eyes. Did that idiot do something again? Or she eyed him carefully, appraising him with a narrowed gaze. Was it guilt festering beneath the surface? She debated calling him out on it, before leaning back in her chair with a heaved sigh. If you say so. Naruto nodded, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He's leaving us, Shikamaru. The Nara wondered how Sakura found him, then recalled that this was his usual haunt, and generally everyone came round at least once to talk to him. And by everyone he meant that loudmouth Kiba, appraising the voluptuous women, or what he assumed were because Kiba wasn't exactly the best judge in females as they passed. Occasionally Choji, who nursed his chips more than his beer. Ino sometimes as well, though that was really just to use him as a ploy to pick up other guys. Even Lee, once or twice, unsurprisingly ordering a soda before chatting up the lazy Jounin the entire night. That was a nightmare. So he wasn't entirely surprised that Sakura knew where he was, as she was ultimately the smartest of their bunch. Well, would have been, if not for him. But usually he didn't count, as mostly he did little else aside from sleep. He's not leaving. Shikamaru sighed, already knowing who she was referring to. It seemed to be the same person everyone was referring to. Naruto always did know how to stir up the Konoha gossip into a wild, brewing rage. Sakura looked like she thought the exact opposite. He's not that dumb. Though invariably, Naruto did have his rather dim moments. Do you think he'd actually betray the village? Of course not. Snapped Sakura, looking offended. And then, deflating, sorry. I've just been on edge lately. Alright. He shrugged. For a moment, Shikamaru hoped she may just leave it at that. But Shikamaru. She began again, unsteadily, crushing his dreams. You saw him, he's not happy here. Shikamaru finished for her, resigning himself to another night of silent, insightful contemplation ruined. I know. She looked down, sullenly. What are we supposed to do? And then, what am I supposed to do? This isn't something you can just fix yourself, Sakura. Quite the opposite, actually. Obviously, it's Naruto's issue. If he decides to involve us, well, that's ultimately his decision as well. All we can do is stand by him and hope he resolves it himself. And if he doesn't? She refuted, voice rising. I mean, not that I don't trust him because I do, implicitly, but Naruto has a tendency to put the world on his shoulders. He always has to be the hero, and I know it's getting him into trouble now, but he just refuses to see it like that, refuses for anyone to help him. And don't you think you're meddling a bit? Shikamaru pointed out, quite used to meddlesome women, as they dominated his life. I know. She bit out, slamming a frustrated fist into the countertop. The bartender wasn't particularly pleased, as almost every glassware he had rattled as the entire place quaked. The background chatter ceased into a weary silence. Sakura looked around, a little guiltily. I know. She repeated, quietly. Oh no, she wasn't going to cry, was she? You're worried, I get it. Shikamaru blew a raspberry. You don't have to be. But what happens? She looked away. What happens if he doesn't want to stay here anymore? Logically? He's going to renounce his title as a Konoha shinobi so he doesn't get marked as a missing nin, probably resign all his duties and go back to wherever he's going. Though Shikamaru figured this was precisely what she didn't want to hear. And you're not concerned? Her voice was rising in pitch again. That he'll do that? That he'll leave? Yes, I'm concerned. Shikamaru rolled his eyes, wondering why all women were so needy. So needy and needing to be assured all the time. Maybe not all women though, he amended. After all, to marry would probably rather take a kunai to the foot than start whining. We're all concerned. Then don't tell me you haven't thought about it. Come up with ideas. She sat herself down on the stool. Do you have any idea where he's going? Any at all? Shikamaru gave pause. Of course he did. At some point in his life, he'd probably thought on everything. And recently, he'd also thought on Naruto, too. That knuckle-headed ninja, always getting himself into some sort of trouble. It seemed to rise with stunning perniciousness as he grew. I have a few. He admitted, though from his sour face it looked like he'd rather not share. After all, they didn't even make much sense, even in his own head. After all, Naruto would know better than to mess with something as all-encompassing as time, right? Sasuke grunted, watching the small fly that buzzed around one of the dimly lit lamps. Kabuto pushed up his glasses with one hand, leaning casually against the rock wall. Him and Sasuke, although he wasn't Orochimaru's subordinate for no reason, he knew that members of Team Hebai were outside the door, were inside a smaller mission room, with a large stretch table and some lamps. It was supposed to set the mood for something like an interrogation, but Sasuke was much too old to be fearing dreary caverns and craggy rocks. That's why said Uchiha leaned back casually in his chair, frowning into the darkness as he did so. Just a theory, of course. Kabuto smiled, leering. But it seems your Uzumaki friend is growing, very powerful. If anything, the scowl deepened. What the hell do you want with me then? There's no evidence of this, of course. We need you to watch Uzumaki closely. We don't know what exactly he's doing or how he's doing it. All we know is that he's extremely powerful and these chakra surges were caused by him. Can you do this? The man pushed up his glasses, eyes twinkling. A cold ferocity rose in those dark eyes at the implication. Of course. Smirking, Kabuto watched Sasuke leave the room. Orochimaru was right, it was so easy to use the Uchiha's pride against him. The boy was an easily manipulated fool. Minato frowned as he looked at the notes once again. As the Hokage-to-be, and counting down the weeks until such, he had easy access to the sections in the library that no one else could, but more importantly, he had access to the Great Hokage Library, filled with techniques no one could possibly even dream of. He was certain that after rummaging through it much to the Sandaime's chagrin, the old man kept saying that he needed to be more careful with these books. He found the books he was looking for. Sadly, they were a bit vague on the topics he truly wanted more detail on. When he asked the Sandaime in person, hoping that the venerable, wise old man may hold more answers than any fortuitous, obscure text could, he was met with a literal brick wall. The Sandaime only mysteriously told him that he may need to look closer than he thought, which only confused the Yondaime to be even further. Was he talking of Naruto, then? That was, assuming that the Sandaime was aware of Naruto's status as a Jinhyuriki, something even Minato hadn't found out about until recently. Jinhyuriki. He tasted the word, like such an ancient, worn word that it almost sounded foreign. He'd heard it before, somewhere. Perhaps in some ambiguous myth lore he'd been told long ago, a circuitous reference he could no longer recall. There was a lot to Naruto he didn't know. And if there was a general rule of thumb to Minato, it was that he didn't like not knowing things. Predictability made him at ease, and Naruto seemed to be the exact opposite of that. Minato could admit to himself that he almost thought of the boy as his son, even though now he realized he knew virtually nothing about him. And his thoughts brought him, indirectly, once more to the blonde in question. Minato sighed. He could just never get away from the kid, huh? Naruto had disappeared again. Obito was relentlessly pacing their meeting place, a red bridge near one of the training fields, but Naruto hadn't shown up in about a week. In fact, there were times when the boy just seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. Rin had tried to use this new tracking jutsu she learned, to trace Naruto's chakra trail to wherever he was. This was still when the two technically, Kakashi was kind of out of it, had thought he was hiding from them and this was some sort of game. So they traced the trail, Minato following their lead amusingly. But, suddenly the trail stopped. Just stopped. There was nothing in its wake but a little bit of charred grass and an ink brush. The three actually were puzzled, wondering if they had followed the wrong trail or something like that. Eventually, they had come to the conclusion that it was a clue that Naruto left for them. At this point, which was about the third day after Naruto's disappearance, Obito and Rin were both stumped on what these clues could mean. The charred grass had to mean fire or something, but what was with the ink brush? There was nothing to connect their evidence, and the two were ready to give up. By the fourth day, Obito had found another one of the clues. A piece of burned paper, not too far away from the end of the trail and tapered to a bush. They figured the wind had carried it away. But by the fifth day the two of them had sighed and went back to their lame D-rank missions. But Minato knew something different. The charred paper and grass meant that the paper and grass were together, and the ink brush was probably from painting the paper. For what, he didn't know. Maybe Naruto was trying calligraphy and got angry, and ended up burning the thing, as ludicrous as the whole idea sounded. Then again, it was entirely possible that he and his team were making such a serious event out of what could be only a trivial matter. It certainly wouldn't be the first time, considering Obito. Sensei. Sensei. He shook his head out of his musings, as Rin ran up to him. What's up, Rin-chan? The young brunette skidded to a halt in front of him, bangs flying out of her face as she beamed up at him. Naruto-kun's back. He blinked. Eyes widening. So Naruto was finally back, huh? Rin took his hand and dragged him down the stairs, and as they burst out of the Hokage Tower she took off in the direction of downtown, and as they progressed further into the crowd, Minato realized they were going to Ichiraku Ramen. Of course, he smiled ruefully, Naruto would return and eat ramen. They were so alike sometimes it scared him. True to his thinking, Obito and Naruto were currently slurping down their second ramen bowl at an alarming rate. He chuckled slightly. Where's Kakashi-kun? Sick. Obito answered breezily, between a large noodle. Rin nodded from beside him. He got caught with a bad cold yesterday, I guess his mask isn't really useful. Naruto chuckled. I think Kakashi uses his mask for different reasons. Minato looked down at him, stern face morphing into a grin with one look at the sunny blonde. Where have you been? Well, you see. Naruto rubbed at his head, setting his third bowl down. I was helping a nice girl with pink hair, and then I was talking to a pineapple for a bit. What a liar. Rin crowed, throwing a chopstick at his head. Naruto ducked. No consideration at all? He snorted, chortling. Why would I, when you're clearly making this all up? Rin puffed, looking annoyed. You're a terrible liar, Naruto. And the blonde smiled enigmatically. But I'm not lying. The girl rolled her eyes before laughing. She swiped more chopsticks and began to fling them good-naturedly at the blonde, Teuchi voicing his protests as they ended up stuck into the side of the stall like kunai. Obito did as well, as Rin plucked his chopsticks right out of his mouth, crying out as he made a grab for them, only to duck as she flung a soy sauce bottle. This would mark the first time Naruto had ever been kicked out of Ichiraku, ever. Oddly, he wasn't too upset about it. But honestly, Naruto. Minato frowned, picking out a fishtail out of his hair. He gave a glance to the other blonde plodding next to him, half of his face and Jounin vest splattered with paint. Where have you been? Around. Shrugged the blonde. And where have you been around for this entire week? Minato asked, eyes narrowed. He knew he was being a bit petulant, but he'd been searching for the other blonde for the better part of 5 days. It was almost strange how easily it seemed the blonde could take a literal swan dive off the face of the earth. And why did you leave us clues? Rin piped up. Naruto stopped suddenly. Clues? He asked, face losing pallor. Yeah. Like the paper, and the ink brushes. Obito piped up. Minato caught the look of sheer timorousness draining the blonde of color, wondering what had the blonde so on edge. Quite apparently, they hadn't been left for them to find. And, true to his intuition, they hadn't been frivolous matters, either. Ah, well. And then just as quickly he was smiling again, rubbing at his hair. Minato noticed he did that a lot. Hell, so did Minato. Well, my friend has been teaching me how to draw animals, but I got so sick of how terribly my drawings were that I just burned them. Eh? Well, a half-truth, anyway. Sai really did teach him how to draw, and it wasn't the first time he'd hurled a fireball at both the irritating Chunin and his own pathetic attempts. Minato only eyed him carefully, his gut warring with his logic. Of course it was something candidly meaningless. What else could it have been? And yet, in the back of his mind came the intuitive clarity honed from years on the field, that burning sensation that reminded him that something was amiss. So where did you go? Obito asked, breaking Tthe Hokage out of his thoughts as he peered up at the other blonde. Go? Naruto echoed, puzzled. I didn't go anywhere. I've been in Konoha this whole time. But. Rin protested. The chakra signature. Most shinobi can mask their chakra. Naruto reminded lightly, waving a finger at her. Rin blushed. That was true. Oh. Wait. Obito butted in. Then, why did you mask your chakra? Naruto blinked owlishly. Minato paused. This was true for once. Obito brought up a good point. If Naruto really wasn't up to nefarious purposes, what was he doing being so sneaky? Minato appraised the other blonde. Naruto had never really given any indication of being anything but a decorous, if not a little stubborn jounin. Was that a wrong impression? And then, the blonde pulled a face, laughing. I was spying on the bathhouse. Rin blinked, once, twice. And then. You pervert. She smacked him upside the head, only to have it turn out to be a log. Naruto snickered as he reappeared next to Obito, the boy giving the older jounin some ecstatic back-clapping and a few enthusiastic yelps. Minato wondered why everyone around him was so perverted. First Jiraiya, now Naruto, who would be next? Kakashi? Didn't strike you as a pervert, Naruto? He chuckled. Naruto only gave him a Vulpin smirk. I learned from my sensei. Said the blonde, seriously, even as his eyes twinkled. Your sensei must have been quite a pervert. The Yondaime surmised, immediately thinking of Jiraiya. Seemed they shared that in common too. Yep. They both were, actually. Of course, Minato wasn't aware that they actually shared the same sensei. Rin gasped in horror. Oh no. Naruto-kun, please don't tell me they rubbed off on you. I was peeking in the hot springs. Said the blonde flatly, rolling his eyes. What do you think? Obito began to throw himself in fits with laughter, wheezing and coughing as Rin gave a terrified cry, waving a finger at Naruto incomprehensibly. Minato let out a bark of laughter, and Naruto found himself turning sharply at the sound, never seeing the Hokage come, so undone. So carefree. He couldn't help it. He was smiling too. Geez. Obito groaned, throwing his plow down on the dirt. I hate farming. What do you think you're doing? Rin wiped sweat off of her brow. Get back to work. Right. Obito squeaked, hastily drawing himself up again. He was a bit afraid of Rin at times like these. Especially when she growled and snarled and was sticky and sweaty, but more importantly, pissed as hell. They were in charge of plowing an old farmer's field. The man himself was sick and couldn't do it himself. Kakashi was finally over that sickness of his, and was somewhere in the backdrop farther off from them. But Obito and Rin were working side by side, that was, until Obito had decided to throw a fit. Honestly. Rin groaned more to herself than anything. I can't believe we have another one of these crap missions. Obito moped. Well, you were the one who said that you didn't want any more. I didn't say that. Rin hissed at him. Moron. I said that we should wait a little before taking on another tough mission, I didn't mean. She waved a hand over the large farmlands. This. Obito just sighed, adjusting his goggles with disdain as he noted the red angry marks they had made on his sweating forehead. It was way too hot to be in black. Actually, for mid-spring it was way too hot in general. Keep at it, kids. Minato waved from somewhere. His position on a large metal bucket seemed comfortable. Shut up. Rin squawked at him, looking away quickly so she didn't have to see her sensei laughing at them. Naruto watched the two with interest. It was kind of mean of you to give them such a crappy mission. He noted with glee. Minato rolled his eyes. You would have done the same. Good point. That's it. Obito, despite Rin's blatant protests, threw his plow on the ground again and growled. Sensei. Minato squeaked. The Hokage-to-be wasn't entirely sure if Obito's mad rage was induced by him or the heat. Either way, it didn't bode a good future for the blonde-haired Hokage. Naruto seemed to be a willing spectator to the event, an amused smile curving around the corners of his lips. Minato wanted to wipe the smug look right off his face. One day, the blonde would get a genin team of his own, and bear the brunt of their incessant needs. One day. We need training. The Uchiha groaned. As in now. As in like, flashy jutsu and cool moves and just, sensei please. I hate to agree with him. Rin called from a little ways off. But it's the truth. There was a moment of silence, as Naruto bowed his head in silent laughter, Obito howled in rage, Rin leaned against her plow, Minato gulped inconspicuously, and Kakashi continued onwards in his work. Was all the Namikaze could manage. Please? Please. It would have worked perfectly, if Minato could actually figure something that he could teach them. Well, water walking? No, already did. Tree walking? Definitely no, that was a while ago. Obito already knew the basics, and he didn't know what else he could teach them besides specialty moves, but even then, it wasn't like he had any moves that his students could learn. Rasengan? Wasn't that a bit of overkill for a training session? Oi, Obito. The boy looked up as Naruto called him. The blonde, who up until then had seemed perfectly content to lounge in the background, sauntered next to the Uchiha. The blonde grinned. Why don't you show me what you know? For a moment, Obito, uncomprehending, only stared curiously at the older ninja. And then, as he fully understood what Naruto was implying, cheered. Somewhere, between shuffled dirt and dead plants, Rin groaned. Watch out, cause this one's gonna hurt. Naruto grinned widely, acting more like his avid porn-reading sensei than he'd ever publicly admit and enjoying every moment of it. If the Uchiha noticed the blonde's light, jovial mood, he certainly didn't show it. In fact, he seemed a bit too preoccupied with his hand seals, a movement which was coming on slowly, but steadily. He still didn't notice, even as Naruto's grin grew more mischievous as their spar progressed. And further still, as he recklessly charged at Naruto in a stubbornness that may quite possibly be inherent in only Uchiha. And then, his eyes widened. And finally, did he look up, surprised and with foreboding horror, to caught the leering smirk on Naruto's face. Kawarimi? 1,000 years of pain. Obito yowled as he was sent flying through the air. Minato fell clear of his upturned seat, howling with laughter and smacking the side of the bucket repeatedly, looking like he may just go into cardiac arrest. Rin had dropped her plow in horror, and Kakashi, well, miraculously Kakashi was absolutely unaware of the good use his future technique was made into, and was tediously tending to his plants. Though perhaps not, as someone made a loud choking noise in the background, and Naruto glanced over to see Kakashi twisting around to stare in incomprehensive wonder as Obito quite literally flew by the seat of his pants. That was totally wicked. Rin cried aloud, loud enough for all of them to hear, regardless of Obito's rather vocal moans of pain. In a typical Naruto fashion, the blonde only rubbed the back of his head, looking mostly humbled by Rin's obvious and quite rightly lionization of him. For a full 3 seconds Rin was completely sure that Naruto was the closest thing to a wise and fair god, as no one had yet to so righteously put Obito into his place as the blonde had easily done this side of the sun, when Obito sprang up with more vigor than usual, flying into his hand-sealing process all over again, behind the unsuspecting blonde. The brunette opened her mouth to warn the blonde, just as Obito opened his. Naruto watch. Katon, Housenkan no Jutsu. Surely the blonde must have realized they were coming, as the fireballs erupted from Obito's throat and seared the already moistened air around them into a fiery blaze, and he had already turned to watch them approach him, turned, and seemed to do little, if anything else. And then, Rin realized that he really wasn't going to do anything else. Naruto, dash. But the blonde only seemed to stare them down, before leaping entirely straight through them, as if they had been nothing but an illusion. Rin gaped, nimbly dodging the incoming fireballs as they crashed into the ground, her and Minato having the arduous task of getting around the attack that Naruto already effortlessly dodged. Well, actually, he hadn't dodged at all, which Rin was still trying to wrap her head around. She looked up as Obito chortled in awe and laughter, having been tackled to the ground by the surprising blonde, quite clearly down for the count this time. Naruto was grinning down at him, looking quite literally like the cat who got the cream. After wiping away most of the flyaway and burnt hair from the impromptu workout she just got, Rin galloped over to them, beaming. How did you do that? Naruto got up, giving a hand to the startled Uchiha beneath him. Oh, I dunno, practice I guess. So cool. Obito practically leapt at him as he stood, hopping over the upturned dirt to do so. You've got to teach me that. He scratched his cheek, laughing sheepishly. Ah well, maybe. But unfortunately for the Uchiha, his unnatural affinity to fire wasn't anything that could be taught. Yeah, so, he may have gotten me that time. May have. Rin butted in incredulously, grabbing for another piece of sushi. Alright, so he did. Obito amended, not even looking winded from his long monologue on his and Naruto's spar, an event which really didn't need retelling, as it had happened a few hours ago, taking a sip of his drink as he did so. But I'll have you guys know that pretty soon it'll be me kicking his ass. I'm going to come with a technique that's not only better than his, it'll be the best ever. Even better than Sensei's Rasengan. Rin quipped. Thousands. Obito agreed, quite serious. Minato looked mostly amused at the blatant disregard for his ultimate technique, only fondly ruffling Obito's hair. He reached for the check before Naruto could even think to, catching the other blonde's smirk with a knowing eye as he moved it out of his read. This one's on me. Naruto looked reluctant, but held off. You're asking to go broke, said the other blonde, with a shrug. This is true. Rin nodded sagely. It's no secret that Obito can eat 10 times his body weight. 2 times. Obito narrowed his eyes. And that was only once. No, just 2 weeks ago when we went to grass you must have consumed at least 200 pounds of rice. That's not even physically possible. The two blondes only let them continue their bantering with an endearing ear, the two of them almost seeming to grow used to the incessant arguing that seemed to inevitably follow when Rin and Obito were in the same room. For a brief second, Naruto thought of how cute of a couple the two could grow to be, the amusing, dear illusion shattered at the thought that neither of the two would ever live to see the day. But this is the past, Naruto reminded himself, with bitter hope. And that's the future. And, for now, neither of the two mattered, because for Naruto, right now, it wasn't either. It was simply, the present. And then, with desolation. But not for long. Soon enough, Rin and Obito went their separate ways, Rin to her house and Obito back to the perpetual gloom of the Uchiha district, neither of the two seeming particularly enamored with the thought of returning home from their surprisingly fun day of D-rank missions. Naruto found himself in a sudden, abrupt silence with Minato, the quiet, warm summer night air devoid of continuous noise now that Rin and Obito left. That was a pretty cool trick, Minato revealed, as the two plodded along together. You think so? Naruto looked up thoughtfully, thinking of how inspired he'd been when the technique had been used on him after getting over all the pain, of course. Yeah. How'd you come up with it? It's pretty inventive. At the apt description of the jutsu's ingenuity, Naruto laughed. It definitely is. But I didn't come up with it. And then, with no small amount of embarrassment, actually, the reason why I know it is because it was used on me at some point. An experience you won't ever forget, I'm sure. Minato chuckled. Not in this lifetime, no. Naruto agreed. All too soon he was once more standing at another crossroad, though in a more figurative sense. He'd been standing at one for quite a while, as Minato was meant to head back to his home, and Naruto to his hotel, and the inevitable future that lay many years away. I'll see you tomorrow. Minato bid cheerily, already moving to the other side of the road. Minato. His breath caught in his throat, in a vicious struggle to erupt out of his mouth. Words wrangled at his tongue, wisdom too dangerous ready to leap from his tongue. For a moment, a startling, clear moment, he imagined himself pulling the blonde aside, this glorious man who would one day save Konoha, and possibly the world, who right now was only a slightly unsure man with a great destiny ahead of himself, and whispering the very tumultuous thoughts that plagued his mind, if only for the selfish notion to get them off of it. But then the moment passed, the significant widening of Minato's eyes and the easing off of Naruto's tension, and the blonde found himself back at the crossroad, Minato pausing curiously to hear what he had to say. But the blonde only shook his head, an enigmatic smile to his face. Never mind. And with that, Minato watched him walk off in the dark, cicadas loud in the night air. And didn't see him again in almost 2 years. Chapter 10, Shimmer. Author's note: I know there's a lot of confusing things in this story that seem like inconsistencies and don't make much sense, but I swear they're all intended at this point. This is an alternate universe and very different from canon at this point, so some things, like the fact that the story is in stasis somewhere between after when Naruto re-meets Sasuke and before Gaara gets taken, but Naruto is a Jounin and has some amount of control over the Kyuubi, are kind of taken as part of that. So, all will be revealed and / or make sense at some point, I promise. I'm not late, am I? Tsunade looked up from the enormous scroll she seemed halfway into, and both Sai and Sakura looked back with paradoxically unanimous unimpressed faces. He chuckled nervously, sliding in place between his two teammates. Back to what I was saying, Tsunade gave him a brutish glare, as if to point out that it was him who had cut her off in the first place. We've noticed growing reports of Otagaku spies encroaching on Konoha territory. You're serious? Naruto gaped, eyes widening. Again, he somehow managed to unintentionally cut the blonde Hokage off. Yes, quite serious. She answered, drily. Also, Jiraiya has stopped writing porn, Kakashi left for the monastery, and I'm actually paying Shikamaru overtime. Funny. Snorted the blonde. Tsunade gave him a low, narrow glare. This isn't good, Naruto. You don't have to tell me, argued the blonde, before turning to his teammates. You think that was what Sasuke was after? Undoubtedly, answered Sakura. Sai gave a non-committal hum. So our assumption was right after all? You don't have to say it so optimistically. Naruto frowned. But they have no proof, right? Orochimaru doesn't need proof, replied Tsunade, looking quite sure of herself. Though most likely she could be, as aside from Jiraiya and the late Sandaime she probably knew the slimy bastard the best. If he even has an inkling of something he wants, invariably he'll go after it. So Naruto's in danger. Sakura's eyes widened, whipping quickly to study the blonde, who seemed ossified into stone. Inadvertently. Tsunade agreed. Most likely he won't go after it himself. It's still a danger. Sakura cut in, obviously fearing for Naruto's safety. Perhaps a little overly so. Naruto seemed oblivious to the conversation, staring pensively and a little fearfully into the lines of wood that made Tsuan's desk, as if they held the answers to his most complex questions. Naruto snapped out of his reverie as Sakura's voice ascended in decibel. And it sounds even worse to me if we don't do anything at all. There's no point in retaliating for something that hasn't happened. Tsunade shot back, wisely, fortunately for us, there are many places for Naruto to hide which Orochimaru likely won't be able to follow. At this, his two teammates turned to him curiously. Really? Sakura deadpanned, eyes narrowing. Naruto swallowed. Tsunade waved her hand. At any rate, that's up to Naruto's discretion. For now, I'd like you, Sai, to deliver this. She pulled a scroll off the massive heap of paperwork on her desk, to Umbu. And then, whipping out another one, and you, Sakura, to bring this to the guards. We're not having another ambush by Otagaku anytime soon. Everyone's going to be alerted well in advance this time. The two nodded obediently, though Sakura looked like she'd rather drop-kick Naruto in the face and wrangle out all his secrets. Fortunately, she only turned smartly on her heel and walked out curtly, Sai at her heels. Tsunade turned to him. You know what to do. He nodded, numbly. This was what he wanted, right? So why did it sort of feel like he was running away? He was still musing on this when he landed in the past, so engrossed in his thoughts he found the first pine tree and jumped to the top, dropping onto the branch and staring sightlessly at the looming faces on Hokage Mountain, instead of immediately taking off for Minato and his team. He wasn't a quitter, and he never gave up. That was his ninja way. So why in the hell did it feel like he was? A strategic retreat isn't the same thing as giving up, he reminded himself, with a voice which sounded oddly like Kakashi-sensei. But he'd never been one for strategic retreats, or retreats at all, for that matter. If he ever fell into a situation where he should probably be hightailing it out of, normally he just summoned more Kagebunshin and did whatever the fuck he could to win. Although, this wasn't some crazy battle. In fact, there wasn't a battle going on at all. This was waiting with uneasy trepidation for the moment to start, peering into the abyss of the future and wondering what lay in its depth. Quite honestly, it made him uneasy. He shook his head. There's no point on dwelling on it now. He reminded himself. I'm already here, and it was the hag who told me to do it. At this, his stomach gave an opportune grumble. May as well get some ramen while I'm at it. There was nothing like the smell of Ichiraku ramen when he was really hungry. It only took a matter of seconds before he was sliding into one of the stools, cracking open a pair of chopsticks, and spewing through a list of orders. Teuchi looked incredibly bewildered with this, much to Naruto's amusement. How long had he been coming here doing this? You'd think the man would be used to it, even in Minato's time. Speaking of Minato, it was curious to see an Ichiraku without his presence, or at least, his future wife-to-be's. Turns out, Kushina was the real ramen lover in the family. She made Minato look like a passing connoisseur. And if not those two, then at least Obito. He was a close second to Kushina, though Naruto had a sinking suspicion he was quickly passing both Minato and Obito in that particular race. He was entertaining himself so much with the idea he hadn't even gotten a good look at the bewildered Teuchi, a young, teenage boy with an apron a few sizes too big. In fact, he didn't even notice anything was amiss until he'd finished up his unnaturally large portion of ramen, paid the bill and was perusing languidly through the streets. He stretched, heaving a great, contented yawn and peeled open his eyes. Only to be met face to face with the Hokage Mountain, looming up in the distance. It wouldn't have been all that surprising, had Naruto not taken the opportune moment to really look at it. And count how many faces were on it. Hold on. His eyes widened, pausing mid-stretch. There's the Shodaimet, the Enidaimet, the Sandaimet. And then, with growing horror, where's the Yondaimet? Although Minato wasn't technically the Hokage yet, the moment the Sandaime had revealed his intentions to give up his seat once Minato was ready for the job, which at this point was rapidly approaching the village, had made quick work of carving out the latest head onto the mountain. They'd made such quick progress that by the time Naruto had even gotten to the past, Minato's face was almost half finished, and the last he'd taken the time to look, it was nearing completion. But now, it wasn't there at all. Naruto numbly sat himself down on the street curb, feeling like his legs were about to give out. Calm down, he told himself, breathing in deeply and hoping like hell he wasn't about to hyperventilate. Calm the fuck down. He had to think through this rationally, which unfortunately was never one of his strong suits. The seal must have fucked up, was all he could think. It was the only logical answer. It must have fucked up somehow, but the question was, how? It couldn't have been through his time seals. If he'd fucked up on those, either it wouldn't have worked and he wouldn't have jumped through time, or he'd be dead right now because he'd managed to destroy himself in the process. Considering neither of those happened, it must have been a malfunction on his tracking seal. But if it was a problem with the tracking seal, then he would have been having problems this entire time. And unless the tracking seal had magically disappeared from Minato's time, then his eyes widened. It hadn't disappeared. It'd been charred clean to ashes. He'd taken to keeping it in his jounin vest, and wearing it around whenever he was in Minato's time. When it came to leave, he'd strip it off and hide it somewhere safe, and then put it on again whenever he returned. He hadn't even thought of the consequences of not dodging Obito's fire technique. Fire never hurt him anyway, and at the time it seemed like good fun to give Obito a surprise like that. Now though, it was increasingly seeming like an awful idea. Because without that tracking seal, there was no way back. The vivacity he had once assimilated with Konoha and its bright, sunlit streets seemed to have left the city completely, along with the timeline he could no longer find his way back to. Konoha seemed to have lost its vigor without them, cast in a dull, hazy gloom which Naruto had never experienced before in the village. Not even when the majority of the people feared or loathed him, had it ever seemed so bleak. He didn't want to go back, not to his own time, where all his mistakes seemed to linger in the strange attempt of a smile that sometimes graced Sakura's face when she thought he wasn't looking, not to Jiraiya and his narrowed, disapproving gaze, not to Kakashi and his aloof, older self. And yet, he didn't want to be here either. Teuchi was just a teenage boy, not even 15 yet, running a shambled ramen stand with his father without a hint of recognition to his face. Everyone Naruto knew or cared about had yet to exist. The Second Shinobi War had turned Konoha into something of a ghost town, villagers quick to return to the safety of their homes at dark, huddled close together and murmuring quietly, nothing like the boisterous village Naruto had always known. Who would be alive now, though? Tsunade and Jiraiya had to be around here somewhere, but the idea of going to look for them didn't hold much weight. He tried to think how old they would be. Jiraiya would be in his 20s, so would Tsunade, and Orochimaru. Naruto wasn't sure how long he sat on that curb staring bleakly at nothing, probably blending quite aptly with the dull Konoha around him. He tried, and failed, to keep the images of Team 7 out of his mind, looping infinitely in his mind, every precious moment that ended so abruptly until he was forcefully snapped out of it. Excuse me? He jumped. Literally. He blinked, the dimness of his eyes slowly coming back to life as he looked down and a little to the left to see who was talking to him. His jaw dropped. A boy was peering up at him curiously from where he had seated himself next to Naruto, a ways shorter than him and looking somewhat bemused by the funny faces Naruto was making. It was like him when he was younger. Except the boy was a tad paler. In fact, he could use a little more sun. Judging from the smooth cream color of his skin, it almost reminded him of the Uchiha pale that Sasuke had. But he was blonde like the sun and goldenrod and saffron flowers. Blonde like sun-kissed hair. And most importantly, blonde like him. With that soft color that was not a true golden, but not platinum. Flaxen almost, it was a shade paler than his own mop of sunshine that was on top of his head. But what caught his attention the most was, "Are you okay?" The blue of his eyes. Like the stratosphere in the bright early morning, like a cloudless summer sky somewhere where everything was beautiful, this glowing blue that Naruto couldn't explain as anything else as just an absolute mirror of his own. Naruto slowly fished himself out of his thoughts. fine. I guess you startled me a bit. Why? You've been sitting on the road for a really long time now. The boy pointed out. The owner of this shop asked me to kick you out. Eh? He turned around, suddenly noticing a rather angry-looking shopkeeper holding a broom rather menacingly from his stoop. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. That's true. The younger blonde who Naruto was very happy to say barely even came up to his waist. Take that, Jiraiya. There were people smaller than him, albeit the boy must have been 10, blinked at him slowly, almost owlishly. Naruto found himself staring again. The beautiful autumn sky brought out the Prussian in both their eyes. Naruto knew he'd curse this question forever, but looking in their eyes he knew he had to. So what's your name, kid? The boy blinked quickly, it seemed he was caught off guard. I'm Namikaze Minato, what's your name? Naruto almost lost consciousness. He knew it. It may have been just a hunch that had launched with the identical eyes they shared, but for some reason, he knew it, he had just known it. This boy was Minato, about roughly 15 years younger than the one he had met before, but still, this boy was his father. His father, who was about the coolest man he had ever met in his life. Naruto, my name's Naruto. Cool. The boy brightened. Naruto grinned at him, but soon the sharpness of it faded into something softer, wistful, even, as he soaked in the last bit of Minato he'd ever get to see. He supposed he should be grateful, even, that he'd gotten a chance to see him at all. It wasn't so bad, even, the blonde consoled himself, staring down at Minato, the blonde grinning outrageously, smiling ear to ear. Oh wait. The boy blinked. Isn't that the swirly stuff in ramen? Naruto balked, but regained his composure quickly. Oh yeah, I guess it is. I'm named after a guy in a book though. A book? The boy blinked. Before he doubled over laughing. That's the stupidest thing I've heard. Naruto wanted to point out that Minato was the one who named him in the first place, but he refrained from doing so. Huh, what are you named after? Minato shrugged, his little shoulders almost looking bony under his shirt. I don't know. Never knew my parents. Naruto's eyes softened as he watched him. People always told Naruto that he really, well, and truly took after his mother. He was loud and obnoxious and stubborn and loved ramen, but perhaps that was only because you really had to know Minato to see how similar they were, and Minato wasn't quick to let people see that far into him. Looking at him now, though, the slump of his shoulders and his downcast eyes, all Naruto could see was himself. The helplessness he felt as a child, the sadness, and the confusion. He was once again enthralled and intrigued by the same sea glass eyes they had. How could anyone say he took after his mother after looking at those eyes? Except now, those eyes were glazed over in sadness, hopelessness, and lost emotions twisted away with the fading of his memories. Naruto looked down at him empathetically. He never knew Minato didn't know his parents either. It almost made him feel bad that he ever hated the man for what he had done. He smiled, softly but genuinely. Yeah, I know what you mean, I never knew mine either. Really? Minato blinked, looking up. Naruto nodded. Yup. My mom and dad died saving the village. And subsequently, sealing a tailed beast inside me. That's really sad. The younger flaxen-haired boy sighed. The world is sad. The boy kicked a pebble with his foot, watching the small gray-colored rock skid across the pavement, bouncing off the sidewalk and tumbling around until it met the road. Somewhere in the distance, a man was bartering around for some paper fans. The street wasn't very long, or very crowded. Maybe, maybe not. Naruto grinned. You know, I might not have known them, but I've found people that I relate to like that. You know what I mean? You don't really need a family when you have really great friends. Oh, I know what you mean. Minato brightened. Hey, you wanna get some ramen? The Uzumaki boy, well, man, technically could have fallen over in the sheer irony of this moment. Yeah, sure. He let himself be dragged over to Ichiraku's once more, the teenage Teuchi no longer present but a stern man instead, Minato seating himself comfortably onto one of the stools, Naruto following suit with significantly less vigor. He'd already ate his full, but there was no such thing as too much ramen, and the majority of the people he knew were convinced his stomach held a small pocket universe specifically for the consumption of ramen, so Naruto had no qualms with ordering again. "One miso ramen please," they both said in unison. They looked at each other, stunned, before Minato burst into laughter. "Why you like miso ramen too?" Naruto, who was used to these odd flukes he had with his father-to-be, only laughed as well. "It's my favorite," he said, his good mood fading as he thought of a similar instance he'd had involving his father and their love of ramen flavors. Minato seemed to pick up on the undertone in his voice, and slowly stopped laughing. "So, where are you from, Naruto-san?" he asked, with such a tactful change of subject for a kid his age. Naruto suddenly remembered why they called him a genius. Naruto tapped his Hitai-8 with his chopsticks lightly, and Minato rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. "Right." He grinned. "Forgot about that. So what rank are you?" "Jounin, you." He might as well not lie about it, he was sure there were enough Jounin that it didn't matter anyways. "Genin." The boy grinned brightly. "I'm almost Chunin, and since the exams are coming up in a week or two and Jiraiya-sensei is going to teach me some ultra-cool moves so I can win." "Jiraiya-sensei?" Naruto echoed. It had been a long time since he had called Jiraiya that. Minato nodded. "Yeah. He's my really cool sensei. He's kinda a pervert though, but," he leaned in closer with a harsh whisper. "They call him and his team Sunin. Isn't that cool? I wish my team had some cool nickname like that." He got up abruptly, pitching his voice low as he cried, "Team Minato, feared from the coast of Iwagakure to the far-flung regions of Kiri." Naruto chortled in laughter. "They don't actually say outlandish shit like that about the Sunin, do they?" If they did, he'd never heard it at least. "No." Minato pouted, before brightening again. "But if my team ever got famous, I'd want them to say stuff like that about me." "Oh, you'll get there," he thought, ominously. He'd get there, all right, and it'd get so bad that he'd have to start fearing for his family and his wife because of his reputation. But for now, it was just a childish dream, and there was no reason to scare him. "Yeah." He played along cheerily, "I'm sure you will someday." And then, he added, "So, these Sunin, huh? They're pretty legendary." "Yeah. They're super legendary. Let's see, there's Orochimaru-san and Tsunade-hime and Jiraiya-sensei." He paused, before adding, "I think Tsunade-hime is still Chunin though, and I'm pretty sure Orochimaru-san just turned Jounin. Jiraiya-sensei just got inaugurated too." "Is that so?" Lucky for him, he got the timeline without even having to ask around for it. 2 steaming bowls of miso ramen were placed in front of them, and the cook smiled at them indulgently. Minato grinned widely, in a way that made Naruto remember the way he used to when he was much younger and him and Iruka-sensei used to go out for ramen, except this time, the roles were switched. He was the older of the two who was reminiscing and Minato was the one who was grinning widely and chattering on. It made his heart thrum, remembering the Minato he would never see again, the one he was going to help defeat Kyuubi. Watching the boy in front of him, Naruto wondered if Neji was right. Was there such a thing called fate? Did this boy have the fate to die as a hero? He was about to follow suit and dig into his ramen when a voice stopped him from doing so. "Oi, Minato-kun, keep eating like that and you're gonna empty this man's pockets." Minato laughed sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. "Planning to fob the bill on me, huh?" Naruto smirked widely, as he handed the money to the cook anyways. "S okay, I figured I would treat you anyways." But as he looked up, he tried not to gape. Jiraiya, who looked like a bit younger version of the one he knew, was smiling, hands on his hips like he was about to start a serious lecture as he rattled on to Minato about how that was a rather bad thing to do. "Hypocrite," Naruto snorted. Jiraiya fobbed the bill on him all the time in the future, to the point that Naruto could have claimed bankruptcy. "Honestly, Minato, you little prankster." "Oh, it's okay." Naruto smiled pleasantly at his sensei-to-be. "Minato helped me out anyways, so I thought it'd be fair to treat him." "You'd be asking to go broke, right there." Jiraiya snorted, and Minato let out an indignant shout. Naruto smiled, but there was something melancholic to the edges of it. "Ah well, I'd better get going, I have to turn in a mission report. See you guys around sometime." The two grinned at him. "Sure." The said in unison, then turned to look at each other, already erupting in a new dispute about who was the original one and who was the word stealer. Naruto would have laughed at their replica of Obito and Kakashi's antics, except for the fact that it hurt to even remember the fact that Obito and Kakashi would never have another spat like that in front of him, because he'd never be able to see one again. In fact, as his subconscious snidely reminded him, he wouldn't see Rin either, or Kushina, or his father, which was probably what hurt the most, because the Minato he had just encountered was not the one he was hoping to see. He scuffed his feet in the dirt, watching as the last bits of light scattered over the horizon. He might as well go home, have some ramen with Sakura, and maybe get an actual mission from the old hag, get back in the swing of things. Maybe he'd talk with Kakashi-sensei, because he honestly needed someone to talk to about this besides Jiraiya, but he wasn't entirely sure that was allowed. In all honesty, he wished he could talk to Sasuke, but Sasuke was out in sound still with that pathetic excuse for a son-in and probably wouldn't care to listen anyways. And more importantly, he was Sasuke. The bastard. Maybe Shikamaru would listen. Rin listened a lot like Shikamaru. Ugh. Damn it, he was thinking in circles again. He could have slapped himself if he could. Why did he keep thinking about them? He was never going to be able to forget them at this rate. They probably already forgot him. He blinked back tears. Would they forget about him? Would they no longer think about him after a week or two that he was gone? He knew for a fact that Kakashi of his time was either an extremely good actor or he only remembered bits and pieces of the Naruto that had visited him back when he was Chunin. Well, Naruto wouldn't hold it against him. The boy was only about 9 or 10 when they met in the past, not to mention the fact he always seemed to get sick at the most inopportune of times. Would Minato name his firstborn child Naruto because of Jiraiya's book? Or because of the man he had met for a month or two while he was in the tumultuous process of becoming the Yondaime Hokage? Would Obito remember him even though Naruto had the sinking suspicion that Obito would be long gone, if Kakashi's left eye was anything to go by? Would Rin even remember him? Wherever she was in his timeline, whether she was dead or just wandering around in the same way Tsunade was. As the last outstretched hand of Peach spread over the mountains, the sun finally succumbing to the darkness of the moon, Naruto finished his seal. He didn't notice the tear that made his way down his face, rather, if he did, he chose to ignore it. Naruto had a moment to lie there in the deafening silence of the hill, nothing but the faint whisper of wind and the occasional rustling of the forest to break the heady quiet, before his eyes snapped open. He drew kunai from his pocket at lightning speed, throwing them out into the trees where they hit the branches and trunks with dull thuds. Immediately after he leapt into the air, to put some distance between him and his attacker as well as dodging the spray of shuriken that landed where he once lay. The blonde flipped in midair, landing soundlessly on his feet in a crouch, weapons drawn and waiting for his attacker to reveal himself. Turns out there was more than one, 4 figures dropping from the trees to the ground opposite the hill, and from here he could vaguely make out their defining features. One was obviously a girl, with blatant and fiery red hair, another with even more blatant and fiery orange hair, a shade of which reminded him grossly of his former jumpsuit, and another with faintly gray-silver hair, and the last with dark black hair, almost blue in the current lighting, and spinning red eyes. Sasuke, he whispered, thrown for a loop. As if he hadn't already gone through enough of an emotional roller coaster these past 24 hours to have him running to the nearest bathroom to throw up all he's ate in his lifetime, his former best friend, and the meaning to his life for the past 3 years just had to show up now, of all inopportune moments. He narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" he called, to the boy whom he once thought of as his brother. The Uchiha said nothing though, his teammate speaking for him. Was it really him who's been causing all these chakra surges? The only female asked the Uchiha, incredulously. Half her hair was matted and wrangled looking, while the other was pin straight. Had she been here, Sakura would have called that a fashion don't. This kid. The one with silver hair balked, eyeing up the blonde. I'd be surprised if he could hold a kunai right. Naruto growled, about to show them just how well he threw kunai when Sasuke lifted a hand, and his teammates immediately quieted. Underestimating him will be your downfall. Sasuke warned. So he'd actually learned something noteworthy these past few years after all. Furthermore, we're to capture him alive. Capture? Unease crawled up his spine at what the word entailed. What did Orochimaru want with him? Whatever it was, it could be nothing good. He didn't voice his fear aloud, only chuckling. Capture? He echoed, mockingly. What, so Orochimaru's got you on retrieval missions now? That's genin duty, Sasuke. He spit the name out with as much contempt as he could muster. Genin duty? The girl pitched, somewhat obnoxiously with her loud, high voice. Please, this isn't your average retrieval duty. Orochimaru-sama has us working too. Karen. Sasuke cut her off swiftly, eyes never once leaving Naruto. He's baiting you. And you're falling for it. She flushed, but shut her mouth. Is that all you guys are here for? He tossed back. Bickering and acting like children. Because if so, I was kinda in the middle of something and would really like to get back to it. Then Sasuke tilted his head, turning to him and surveying him coolly. Finally stopped chasing after me then, dope. He threw the word that at one point could even be considered a backwards term of endearment out like it was trash. Naruto couldn't tell anything from his expression. Never. But he swallowed the bile in his throat and lifted his chin. Maybe I realized there were better things to waste my time on. There was something there then, a flicker in those sherry non. But Naruto couldn't be sure if it was anger at the insult or something more. Naruto cursed inwardly though. There was only so much time he could waste riling them up. And Sasuke had already blocked his only way of getting information. The girl had seemed his best way to gather more information, too. He was in the dark here, and he didn't like it. There wasn't anything in the world he could think of that he'd rather not do right now than fight through Sasuke and his new ragtag team of fucked up weirdos, and once more it seemed his best bet would be for a strategic retreat. And God, how he was starting to hate that phrase. It was really starting to define his life. There was little else he could do, though, so without another moment of waste he summoned as much of Kyuubi's power as he could, drawing it forth from the seal and probably waking up the demon in the process. It pulled and wrenched out of him until finally it erupted from the seal, a Vesuvian explosion of red-hot heat taking shape in a long, almost incomprehensibly tall pillar of magma-like fire, looming above them all and flickering in the sky. Jugo and Karen charged first, the other two lingering in the backdrop. At first, it looked like their vision had been blacked out by a genjutsu technique, but, once the fiery sensation of being burned at temperatures worthy of volcanic lava receded, they realized that this was not genjutsu. The fire was almost like a ring surrounding Naruto, hot and the color of red ochre, dancing with delight and lapping at grass and flesh alike. The two jumped back, holding their burnt appendages, and the entire group fled out of the circle. As the circle of fire moved, they realized that it was a large tail of burning fire, flickering about at Naruto's wool. The fox, Sasuke realized. Naruto had called out the fox. He was controlling the fox. On his own. What kind of Kekai Genkai is this? Bemused the one with silver hair, looking far too excited at the prospect than he should be. What does it matter? The red-headed girl retorted, shaking out her left hand which was licked raw with burns and drawing weapons. We'll take him down either way. The silver-haired boy ran through seals rapidly as the girl sprinted forward, unleashing a barrage of shuriken and kunai alike. The blonde dodged them easily enough, and what he didn't, the large tail would swoop down, blocking for him and melting the metal into cooling drops of liquid on the ground. The girl backed off, cursing in annoyance. Damn, that's pretty hot. Probably not hot enough. The boy smirked. Sasuke turned to his silver-haired companion. Don't. That's the... But he had already finished up his hand seals, bellowing, Suten, Suishusha. A wall of water erupted from the Suten user, barreling straight into the large column of fire surrounding Naruto. Karen whooped at the hit, about to congratulate her teammate when the sound of hissing steam met her ears. A fine cloud of mist covered the blonde for a few moments, before the red of the fiery tail swept forward, revealing that the water jutsu hadn't done much of anything. Kyuubi no Kitsune. He finished. His team turned to him, looking towards him with varying degrees of shock and apprehension. His face was impassive as always, the pinched, almost bored expression seeming to be ossified from stone into his facial features, but it still looked like it pained him to say the words, "We'll retreat for now, We can't beat him like this. They took off soon after that, and Naruto breathed a sigh of relief. The tail dispersed into wisps of flame, before eventually taking to the air in tendrils of smoke. He stared back into the forest where his best friend had once more disappeared to, and wondered at the numbness, the lack of emotion, which felt cold and unnatural in his stomach. Naruto wanted to try it. He wanted to try it, as he forgot about the tears that dried on his cheeks, because he wanted to just see where it would end up. Actually, as far as those things concern, he wasn't really doing this for any sort of self-indulgence. Maybe he was, just not on a conscious level. He just needed to try it again, as an experiment, as a trial, just like it was supposed to be. And, while with one arm he carefully smoothed the ink brush over the glossy papyrus paper, the shop had, sadly, run out of rice paper in size 10x15, so he had to use the papyrus paper, and with the other he wiped his eyes, so that his tears wouldn't drip onto the paper. He sniffed, and told himself he hadn't, mainly because if he realized how upset he was over this, then he'd realize how depressed he had become too. Somewhere, between the fluttering wind that carried his emotions, and the dripping water, a beast opened its eyes slowly. Ram, dragon, tiger. The heavens rumbled and the earth quaked, and then the flash of blue was gone, and the hill had yet another crumpling paper on its side. It was raining, wherever he had landed. It was raining in sheets and torrents, and it soaked his black and orange jacket all the way through, the black undershirt clinging to his lean torso and soaking his skin. His hair dulled with the lack of sunlight, a faded saffron that matched his somber mood. His eyes didn't bother to leave the wet dew grass that it was watching dully, his rainy eyes a melancholy blue. He didn't bother. What was the point anymore? What was the point in anything? What was the reason that he even bothered to get up in the morning when everything had been stripped of him the moment he had been born, and from then on he had to climb with blood-wrenched hands and scars, the lifestyle of someone who never had a chance. The rain was soft, a pitter-patter and the faint rustle of trees in the wind. He wondered where he was. But, he couldn't bother, and he trudged through the forestry and down the muddy grass, a small current of water passing by the wet verdant blades. His feet moved in slow patterns, soft and barely even noticeable. He moved so slowly it didn't look like he was moving at all. His face turned to the ground, watching the current move around his feet, puddles forming in some places and the dirt started to upturn itself. The water splashed as he moved about, but it was raining so hard and fast it seemed it'd never end. With his conscious a broken mess of emotions and heart, his subconscious was the one to smell the ramen from somewhere along the water-laden street. He moved on his body's own accord, his eyes never leaving the asphalt, as the water ran like mice scurrying around, flooding the sewers and soaking everything to the chill bone. He didn't notice, eyes dull and lifeless and his mind so caught up in contemplating why the hell he was even here to really do anything. For all he knew, he could have been in the desolate regions of Iwa, in the middle of the war with a Konoha headband, and he wouldn't have cared. At this point, he wouldn't have cared for anything. Without knowing it, without seeing or hearing or smelling, he sat down and sank slowly into the old leather of the stool, his form dripping like its very own rain shower, the dripping of his jacket going as fast as the pitter-patter of the storm on the other side. He was yet to realize where he was, wondering about more pressing matters, about why he was feeling like this, and how to forget. "Can I get you something?" Naruto said nothing, not even breaking out of his stupor. "Sir. Just a miso ramen." He hadn't even realized he had said anything, so used to sliding into Ichiraku with stools like these that he hadn't noticed where he was, or where he could have been. "Okay, coming right up." Huh. Naruto started dumbly, finally pulling himself out of his depression-induced stupor to realize he had just said something. The man looked at him strangely. "Miso ramen, right?" "Oh, sure." Naruto agreed, wondering distantly how he had even said something without even remembering. He didn't even remember walking over here. Was he that in thought? The man behind the counter nodded, but Naruto wasn't really paying attention to him. In fact, he wasn't really paying attention at all. Naruto realized belatedly that he really didn't know what to do anymore. He didn't have to wait very long, though. That's it for part 4. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.